There's an interesting phenomenon when it comes to studying history. When exploring earlier times, we have to be aware of how our own presuppositions impact the way we interpret the events, characters, and consequences of those times. There are two things to be aware of that need to be held in balance. The first is to recognize that the political, social, and cultural environment we currently live in is not the same as that of previous generations, no matter how recent or how ancient. Nonetheless, without question, there are some fundamental human characteristics in our psyche and behavior that shape the core of our human condition. So we can't simply discard all of our presuppositions when looking at the historical record. It's with that in mind that we enter into the topic for this episode. Our purpose is to learn about the broader intellectual, political, religious, and social landscape of the late medieval period. As we explore and gain a better understanding of this time period, we'll gain insight into the reasons Luther's 95 Theses shook the foundations of late medieval Christendom. The first thing to recognize when considering the era Luther was born into is the role religion played in daily life of Europeans. Simply put, religion and theology were deeply woven into the social, political, and economic fabric of daily life. We can actually look to the mindset of the Islamic countries in the Middle East today in order to understand the outlook of 16th century Christian Europe. The laws and rights of religion and society completely overlapped. In fact, in Luther's day, the concept of the separation between church and state was non-existent. Across the board, the religious establishment influenced secular issues and vice versa. There's no better example of this than in the legal system of the times. The rules and regulations governing the church impacted the secular legal system. A case in point is found in the function and duties of godparents and baptismal sponsors. In our day and time, baptismal sponsorship doesn't hold much significance. People tend to choose friends or family members. For many, it symbolizes a relationship bond as much as anything. This was not the case during Luther's time. In the 1500s in Germany, it was given that children would be baptized. The question concerning one's religious affiliation was moot. But, unlike today, in Luther's time, the significance of who agreed to be a godparent of a child had legal significance. How so? Because the godparents became the child's legal guardian and caretaker if both parents died. Therefore, when considering who might be a godparent, the greatest concern for the parents was the social and economic position of the baptismal sponsor. That in itself is certainly interesting, but this small detail actually influenced secular laws. When looking at the legal codes of the late Middle Ages, you'll see that communities established laws that forbade sexual relationships between godparents and godchildren. That would seem to be a given in our day and age. But in Luther's time, parents could choose the child of a wealthy baron or nobleman so that the child could be cared for by someone with means and power. Thus, in order to curb abuses and mistreatment, secular laws were established arising out of a religious practice. This is a great illustration of the intentional interconnectedness of religious and secular life in those days. Today, of course, if a Protestant denomination or a Roman Catholic Church were to make a law, it wouldn't necessarily impact our daily life. But during Luther's time, the laws of the state were frequently deeply intertwined with religious laws and functions. In addition to the legal system, the religious landscape played a central role in the economy and politics of the times. This is especially evident in the monastic life of the Middle Ages. Monasteries and convents were common to most communities, big or small. In fact, in some ways, there was competition between the monastic communities. How so? The religious orders did not function exclusively for religious devotion. They also served as social service agencies, such as convalescent homes, orphanages, or residences for the elderly. Of course, this could not be done for free. Like all other institutions and organizations, the monastic community needed to support itself. Therefore, when agreeing to receive a new person into the community, the two parties would draw up a contract whereby the people who were entering the religious order would bring some sort of dowry to be used to help support the community's needs. As you might imagine, in order for an organization to survive and thrive, good business practices were applied that were also tied up with the spiritual benefits of being in the religious community. Over time, religious orders would own pieces of land spread throughout the countryside. Of course, to make things simpler, the monastery or convent would often be interested in consolidation of their assets and properties. This opened the door for potential corruption. Records show that religious orders would actually receive competing bids from potential residents to see who would offer the most profitable dowry, and that would determine who would be given a spot at the monastery or convent. Needless to say, this practice was vulnerable to the charge of simony, which is the practice of providing religious benefits and services for a price, something forbidden in light of Acts chapter 8. Now, where there's apparent corruption, there needs to be both laws and law enforcement in place. Here we can see how and why religious oversight requiring jurisdiction and a new body of law evolved. In other words, these types of circumstances greatly impacted the development and role of the canon law in the Roman Catholic Church. Things get even more complicated when looking at the various governing entities which were part of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember that in addition to the authoritative voice coming from Rome, all people, including those in religious orders, had to contend with the local authorities, laws, and ordinances which governed the local territories. For instance, laws governing property rights and taxes were constantly at issue when religious orders were given portions of an estate. And if you were part of a religious order, the government you answered to was primarily the Pope, which meant your revenue stream went to the papacy and not to the local sovereign. Thus, if a piece of property became the possession of a religious order, that impacted the local government's revenue significantly. You're probably getting a sense of how different Luther's religious and political context was from our experience today. Not only was there little to no distinction between religious and secular jurisdictions, there were various layers of oversight and governmental authorities interwoven with one another. There was a local authority in the form of a territorial elector or a local city government, and then there was an overarching authority of the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor. At both the local and higher levels of authority, the distinction between secular and spiritual oversight was blurry. This is especially true with regard to the Pope. Remember, he had both spiritual and political authority. The Pope governed a territory and thus needed an army to protect it. With an army, one needs resources, thus an income is necessary, and to gain income, you must have taxes. At this point, we can see how the spiral started to move to a point at which the papacy became enmeshed in the political sphere. Naturally, the next question became, where does the Pope get the money? Answer: the establishment and oversight of local churches. In other words, churches became a revenue source. In the Middle Ages, churches were established primarily by two means. The local bishop, with the authority and help of Rome, could build a church, and a local leader, either a prince, a wealthy baron, or a town council, could establish a church. The attraction of having a stake in the church was, as you might imagine, financial. A perfect case study of this type of establishment is found in the city of Erfurt, where Luther was a monk. In that city, you have two Roman Catholic churches sitting side by side. One is the cathedral, where the bishop reigns. The other is a collegiate church, which was established for and by the secular clergy. Both served a specific purpose for different populations. Establishing a church was certainly founded on the spiritual needs of the local people, but money certainly played a role as well. People wanted to have their sins forgiven and gain favor with God. So when they needed God or a favor from God, they would call their local religious person to be an intercessor. Through a priest, you would receive a sacrament, have a prayer or mass said in your honor, and the list goes on, all to gain favor with God. In return, you would give that priest a gift or make a donation to the church. The local priest then would collect that money, and then it would work its way down the food chain. First, the person who built the church kept a percentage of the money. The local bishop skimmed his portion off the top, because if you didn't pay the local bishop, your clergy and sacramental credentials could be stripped. The local bishop then paid taxes to the papacy, which was responsible for appointing the bishops. What kept this nice little system running was the notion of authority. Christian tradition had evolved into an understanding that the Bishop of Rome was considered to be the successor of the Apostle Peter, and Peter was considered to hold the keys to the kingdom, i.e., the authority to forgive sins. From this came the notion that the Pope had the authority to grant forgiveness because he was in direct line of succession from Peter. As such, the Pope could then distribute that authority to whomever he wanted, thus putting that next person in line of succession from Peter. This understanding of apostolic succession, as it's called, through Peter had a twofold effect. First, the Pope had a monopoly on spiritual power. If he wanted to, he could keep a person from having favor with God. Second, the Pope had the authority to appoint and ordain those who were responsible for carrying out the office of the keys across the countryside. In other words, the Pope had the authority over the bishops, the clergy, and the religious orders. That meant if someone didn't do what the Pope wanted, such as contribute a decent percentage of the revenue to Rome, he had the authority to make them pay. With these things in mind, we can get a better understanding of how and why Martin Luther's 95 Theses rumbled across the countryside when he simply questioned whether or not the Pope had the authority to forgive sins in his own name. The ramifications of calling the Pope's authority into question were broad and numerous, and, as history reveals, ultimately reshaped the landscape of Western Christianity.